first about how the right took over this country, and then we can think about how to do it in general. Oh, I'm sorry. There's one more thing I have to tell you about these types of power, and this is really important. All of these types of power are fungible. If you have enough of one, you can trade it for any one of the others. It does not matter which one you start with. If you have enough of any of these types of power, you can trade it for the others. Which is part of why having too large a concentration of any kind of power is incompatible with democracy. Because democracy, by definition, is broad distribution of political power. But you cannot maintain broad distribution of any type of power if too much of one of these types of power is concentrated in one region. All right, so how to take over a country. Let's say I'm a big fan of Ayn Rand. I'm not, just to be clear. How would I do it, right? The general recipe is you dominate one form of power. Doesn't matter which form you start with. Pick a form. In this country, they started with economic power and moved on to other forms of power. In Iran, they started with religious power and moved on to other forms of power. You could pick your type of power, but you'd start by dominating one form of power. Then you claim that's the only legitimate mechanism for deciding what things are. We can only do markets. That's the only legitimate mechanism for deciding anything, right? Or religion is the only legitimate. I had an argument, I kid you not, with 3 senior members of the Taliban while I was in Berlin in November. They think religion is the only legitimate mechanism for deciding power. I didn't like it for some reason. I mean, the fact that I'm a liberal American woman. By the way, in case any of you were wondering, the Taliban really are very bad people. And then you leverage it to dominate the others. That's the basic recipe. If you want to take over a country, that's how you do it. And that is true globally in every example I can come up with. So how the Randians took over? They started with economic power. They got a bunch of unregulated markets in place, right, where they're allowed to internalize profits and externalize risk and cost. So every time stuff works, they make more money, and when stuff doesn't work, the rest gets paid. They use imperfect information. So Goldman Sachs, for example, bundled up mortgages that they knew were going to go bad. They sold them to pension funds saying, these are great mortgages. Then they bet against them so that when the mortgages failed, they'd make a bunch of money. Imperfect information. I got to take economics from some of the most prominent neoconservative economists in the country right now. Greg Mankiw taught me macroeconomics, and very much former Bush Council of Economic Advisors. But even he acknowledged that externalities and imperfect information would break markets. They do not work. And then you remove the courts as a recourse. All of this stuff about tort reform is about making sure that we, when they screw things up and pocket the profits and externalize the costs, have no recourse. So that's how they started to dominate economic power. Technology and globalization have accelerated that process substantially. I'm doing my penance for having bad technology. It's where I'm in politics. I apologize to everyone. It isn't really why I'm in politics. I do occasionally feel like I have penance to do. The tax system was rigged to favor the accumulation of capital. So if you are worth $100 million and you have that all in stocks, bonds, right, you typically pay about 15% tax on the income that's generated. Sometimes you pay 0, but most of the time you pay about 15%. You and I, if we actually go to work, get a real job for a pay not only a higher income tax percentage than that, but we also have to pay Social Security tax, right? When we spend the money on things, we pay sales tax. I mean, our tax rate massively favors making money by being wealthy over making money by actually working, which I think is backwards. And then they extended it into political power, right? Power is fungible. They've rigged both elections and governance. There's a thing that was published in about 1974 called the Powell Memo, which describes to them how they could rig both elections and governance, which they did. And they were smart enough to do both simultaneously, right? We don't even talk about the fact that the rules of Congress are rigged. Well, we talk a little bit more about the filibuster now, because I spent a year of my life organizing a coalition to reform the filibuster. Progress. Elections, they've made them very, very, very expensive. This will be an expensive election. Any of you who feel like contributing, we can use all the help we can get. They're very expensive, and they allow unlimited funding now, frequently with kickbacks. So Tom DeLay had this program set up where if you were a large business and you contributed to Republicans, he would pass laws in your favor. If you were a large business and you didn't pass, and you didn't support Republicans, he would pass laws that would hurt you. Right? And he was very overt about it. And governance. I talked about how they starved legislators of resources, right? The staffing problems, the lack of shared staffing. They make the only governing resources privately funded. The Republicans, I've described to you the problem with not having expertise inside of Congress. The Republicans have the Heritage Foundation sitting literally a block from the U.S. House of Representatives. I walk by the building every day. $76 million a year. They spend about $380,000 per constituent member of Congress per year to provide them with expert staffing. The Ryan budget was written by 3 staffers at the Heritage Foundation. When Frank Luntz does talking points and distributes them, he gets paid by the Heritage Foundation to do so. Even when new Republican members are elected and looking for staff, the Heritage Foundation finds them staff, trains the staff, and places the staff in the offices. Do you know how much Democrats spend on comparable services on the left? 0. Not a dime.
Why is that? Why not?
Well, the answer to that is complicated, but there are kind of 2 pieces of it. One is the Republicans think a lot, they've set up a virtuous cycle. So if I'm David Koch of Koch Brothers, and I make a contribution to the Heritage Foundation, I know the Heritage Foundation will pass policies which will make me richer, which give me more money that I can contribute to the Heritage Foundation. So there's return on investment on the right. We don't have any virtuous cycles on the left. We have no return on investment. And this actually gets to why I decided to run this company. We don't have people thinking about systems. We don't have people in DC thinking about the big systems in which we're operating and how we fix them. They spend a lot of time inside the system trying to figure out whether they can win given the rigged rules, but they don't take a step back and say, how do we unrig the rules? How do we fix them?
Isn't that sort of a terrible indictment of Pelosi? She was the Speaker of the Democratic President when they unrigged the rules.
The day-to-day dynamics inside the House, by default, make people very focused on what are the next 5 bills that are coming up, and less able to take a step back and look at the big picture. I have a number of people who are actually personal friends who are members of Congress. So Tom Crail is a personal friend of mine. Jared Pulse is a personal friend of mine. Shelley Pingree is a personal friend of mine. They have to be progressive, that's really good. But I would talk with them, and they were so, their days are scheduled so that every day is a set of 15-minute slices. From the moment they wake up to the moment they go to sleep. Every 15 minutes they have some different thing they have to do. That's for 7 days a week. It gives them the worst cases of induced ADHD I've ever seen. They can't focus on anything for more than about 15 minutes. But they never get a chance to step back and reflect on it. The odd thing about what I spent the last couple of years doing is because I was working with the Congressional Progressive Caucus, putting together and running their foundation, I was enough on the inside to be able to see everything that was going on. But I wasn't caught up inside the machinery and the gears. And we don't really have people on our side that are that close to Congress but not caught inside the mechanisms. So the lack of virtuous cycles, the lack of people who are looking at it big picture and have the ability to take a step back and say, let's unrig the rules. And then the third piece piece, and I don't want to underestimate this, is when I would go to talk to big funders about the need to fund something like Heritage on the Left, they wouldn't believe me when I told them it didn't exist and it was needed. In their heads, they thought if it was really needed, then somebody would have built it. I had a very funny conversation with, there's a woman in Seattle who's a member of the Democracy Alliance, which is this big funding, Valerie Trigo. And Valerie is an old friend of mine. And I was talking to Valerie and I said, I want to, in 2011, because this was at the end of 2010, I want to give media training and PR help to progressive members of Congress so that they know what messages they can deliver that will resonate well with the American people. Right? They know how to phrase progressive values in ways that people actually buy into them. They have practice on camera with professionals so that they deliver well. We have a PR person actually trying to put them in the press. Right? I want to provide that set of services to these members of Congress. And Valerie said, well, that's already happening. And I said, no, it's not. And she said, well, it must already be happening. Somebody must be doing it. I mean, it's not happening. And so I set up a training with 6 members of Congress. And I said, okay, Valerie, come to DC, sit in this training, watch what others are doing, then ask them questions at the end. And we got to the end, and she said, so when was the last time you all had media training? And to a person, they said, we've never had media training since being elected. Darcy's the only person doing it. But she literally couldn't believe it wasn't happening because it seemed so obvious it should. That there's this assumption that the infrastructure is there when it's not. And we have taken a shortcut on the left frequently in public dialogue of blaming all of these problems on our members of Congress being spineless and weak and wimpy. The idea that every single person we've ever elected shares exactly the same character flaw, which doesn't manifest until the moment they get there, seems a little far-fetched to me. Though that is the conventional explanation. The real problem are structural. Now, we do send some people who are not optimal. I happen to think that the fetish with the idea that the problem is that we're not doing enough bipartisan stuff and we're not is wrong, based on all of my experience in DC. And sending people who think that's the problem, they're not going to be able to solve anything, because that's not actually the problem. Okay, moral and religious power. What is the right doing with respect to moral and religious power? They have this idea of the prosperity gospel, where they've taken the actual message of the Bible and converted it. Right? The Bible talks about how the rich aren't going to get into heaven. Traditionally, people who have practiced profound Christianity have taken advantage of poverty. Right? But they've turned it right on its head and they've said, if you're rich, it's because God says you deserve to be rich. Focus on the Family is an enormous communications network in which they're trying to spread these ideas. I actually went to the Focus on the Family reading list and bought some of their books and read them to try to understand the mentality. Because I couldn't really understand how you could claim that cutting funding for food stamps for children was consonant with any message I'd ever seen in the Bible. And what I discovered, the reading list is really very interesting. They have these books in which they say, well, the Bible says that we should take care of the sick. And you would think that would mean that we should have universal health care. And that certainly seems like it. But no, because that would make people dependent. And they come up with these really convoluted arguments to try to justify it. They've got an enormous network focused on doing nothing but that. And then the Christian Coalition organizes those folks and makes them active in politics.
Focus on the Family also spends a lot of money making these extreme arguments against queer people and queer civil rights.
It's true. I am, because I'm an infinitely curious person, on like Huckabee's mailing list. Huckabee has started making educational videos for children.
Guys, you know how to play guitar?
Alas, no. So, military power. So I have a number of friends who are former very senior military leadership, including some retired generals. Under George W. Bush, he actually put a partisan litmus test in, and he pushed out any generals who were not avowed Republicans. Because of the wars and the dilution of American strength and the degree to which what has happened goes against all military training about what works and what their job is, there is a real backlash among both members of the military and their families, so that they're now much more winnable. Which, came home to me when my dad said they're thinking about cutting military retirement, I'm thinking about becoming a Democrat. I was like, you went to the Republican National Convention in 2008. I was on the ballot.
Darcy, would you remind us what the Powell Doctrine?
Oh yes, I'm sorry. So the Powell Doctrine, Colin Powell had put forth this idea that the soundest military strategy in a world in which you have lots of little skirmishes is if you need to go in with such overwhelming force that there is zero chance, less than zero chance, that the other side can even really put up any kind of fight, right? You go in with way more force than is actually needed. You are there quickly, you don't go in unless you have an exit strategy, and you get out quickly, right? And in a world of little military skirmishes, because that's how you exercise military power in a way that's effective, we obviously haven't been doing that.
So blitzkrieg and shock and awe.
Well, they've been using the words, they just haven't been using the policy.
Right. Also, another thing you add to that is just the revocation of the Second Amendment rights to a lot of the veterans. That sits real good with them.
Cultural power. Fox News is the largest broadcasting network in the country. It's watched by more Americans than any other news source. Here's an interesting tidbit for you. One of the major public policy firms was trying to understand for the different sources of news, how useful were they in people actually understanding what was going on in the world. So they had a baseline. They polled a bunch of people who didn't watch any source of news, right? They don't read newspapers, they don't listen to radio, they don't watch news on television, right? And that was sort of their baseline. How much do they know about what's going on? And people pick it up through osmosis, listening to the conversations around them and stuff. So they know something about what's going on in the news. And if you watch, MSNBC, it's this much higher. If you read newspapers, it's this much higher. If you, if you listen to NPR, it's this much higher. If you watch Fox News, your understanding of current events is actually below the baseline. You are better off not watching anything than you are watching Fox News if you want to understand what's actually going on in the world.
Is it true that Fox News was sued and won the right to lie?
Yeah. And then Glee, which is one of the most popular shows on television today, is a Fox network show. Bones, one of the most popular shows on television today, is a Fox network show. House, a Fox network show. American Idol, a Fox network show. 24, a Fox network show. Anybody think perhaps they're making a play to get in a position where they can exercise some cultural power? Maintaining broad distribution of power is really hard. Benjamin Franklin sort of notoriously after the Constitutional Convention was asked by a woman in Philadelphia, "What kind of government have you given us, Mr. Franklin?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." It's hard. That's what checks and balances were about. It's going to require an enormous amount of work on our parts, particularly right now. And we have to be thinking about the problem more broadly than just who do we elect. Now, I don't want you to not think about the problem before we left. But it isn't enough. It isn't enough.